My name is Andreu Casas. I'm a Moore's Law Fellow at the Center for Data Science at the New York University. I'm super happy to be here, so thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to start us off with an introduction to automated image analysis for social science research. Before I give you an overview of the things that I'm going to talk about, I thought that I would introduce myself and just give you a brief overview of the things that I do in case any of you also work on this stuff. If you see me around and you want to chat about it, this is what really gets me excited. So basically, I always have a hard time explaining what I do because I do a lot of different things. And so I decided one day to put a Venn diagram together. Hopefully it's going to be useful. You can give me feedback on that. So I'm a political scientist by training. And so what I care the most is policy and policy change. So basically, how did we end up having, I don't know, the education system or a segregation system that we have in a given place, right? And what can different people do to change the status quo in a given point in time? And to me, that's a function of things that happen outside of formal political institutions and what happens inside of these formal political institutions. So part of what I do is I study interest groups, social movement, and political mobilization in general, so what happens outside. And especially I use a lot of digital media because it gives me rich data to understand and study these processes. And I also study how digital media has shaped this mobilization and protest dynamics. Then, as I said, policy and policy change is a function of what happens inside of formal political institutions, and I do a lot on legislative politics. And especially what I'm really interested is in understanding why some members of Congress or members of parliaments are successful at pushing their ideas to solve a given problem, and some of them just fail, right? What explains that variation? And of course, otherwise I wouldn't be here, I suppose. I use computational methods to answer questions in these two areas. So I use a lot of text analytics. For example, in my stuff on legislative politics, I use a lot of text reuse to understand how policy ideas, basically something that proposes a given member of parliament today, might not be successful today, but maybe in 5 years, that idea, someone else picks it up. And whoops, I suppose I'll have to be moving. I'll try to go quicker. So someone else might pick it up and put it in a new bill, and then it might be successful. So I use a lot of text reuse to map this flow of ideas. And I also do some computer vision stuff I started a couple years ago, but that's more related to the political mobilization research. So how can images basically foster or encourage people to decide to pay attention to a given political movement and to engage with that political movement? And you'll see some of that today. So let me give you an overview of the things that I thought would be nice to talk about. You might disagree, let's see how it goes. So the first thing that I wanted to think, that all of us could think together is, why do images matter? And why, as a political scientist in my case, or as a social scientist in general, why should we care about images, about visuals, about videos? What is about them that make them relevant in the political world? The second thing that I wanted to do, and that's going to be more theoretical, then there will be kind of a theoretical, technical section. So I'm going to talk about automated image analysis, computer vision, and what's on the back of a lot of the computer vision algorithms that we use nowadays are these neural nets or convolutional neural nets. And maybe like part of you are already familiar with what that means with deep learning, with neural nets. But I'm sure that part of you are not. So I'm going to walk you through what is a neural net, how do they work, and what is a convolutional neural net, and how do they work. And I think that's important basically because as you learn more and you start applying and programming these neural nets for your own research, if you don't have a good understanding of how they work, it's just really hard to debug them, to program them, etc. Then I'm going to talk about convolutional neural nets as they are being used in political science research nowadays. I'm going to give you a couple or three examples of very recent papers that have used this technology and automated image analysis to say something about politics. And hopefully this is going to inspire the kind of research that you might do in the future. And then let's see if we have time. We are working with my team in this idea of unsupervised classification, and basically in using unsupervised model in image analysis to reduce manual annotation tasks. I'll say more at the end. Then we're going to have a break, and after the break, we'll have a hands-on tutorial where I'm going to share code with you, and I'm going to run it with you. And it's going to be code to fine-tune or train a convolutional neural net to build an image classifier. In this case, it's going to be a classifier that is going to allow you to know whether an image is of a protest, a street protest, or not. And that's just an example that then you can, change or adapt to your own research, however you want. Right? And feel free to interrupt me at any point in time if you have any question. All right? So let's start. Why do images matter? Why, as a political scientist, especially as a person who works on political communication, why should I care and pay attention to images? So the first thing that makes images very relevant is that they attract people's attention. For example, in here, I have a screenshot from the New York Times from 2 or 3 days ago. And there is some research that I'm citing here that clearly shows that the way people consume the news, especially nowadays, especially younger population, is by first taking a look at the headline, right? So how America got to zero tolerance on immigration. But before reading more on a news story, the second thing that people do is they go to the image. They try to see what is the image telling us about that particular topic, right? So images capture people's attention, and sometimes people don't even read the rest of the news story. So just with that, point of knowledge, that's already telling us that images are particularly important. Then it's not that people pay more attention or are more likely to pay attention to images than to text. People remember, or it's much easier for them to remember the information that they learn through visual information than textual information or through a conversation, right? In here, I'm citing this experiment in which Pavio et al., and it's from a long time ago, 68, so it's not a new thing at all. They were showing a set of objects to people in a given order, and they had to remember the order of those things. And they had 2 different groups. One experimental group only saw the images, and another experimental group saw the name tags, right? And then they had to remember the order. And the people who saw the images were able to reproduce the order of those objects much more easily than the other group, right? And then a lot of subsequent studies came out and clearly showed that, whatever we learn through visuals, we are more likely to remember. And so if we go back to the previous New York Times story, if we never saw that picture of a police officer arresting someone on the border, maybe 10 days after, we would not remember that there was a story about immigration and about the zero tolerance policy. But by seeing the image, we're more likely to recall that that's a salient and important issue. And the third thing that research clearly shows that images are very relevant is because images are a lot more likely to generate and evoke emotions. For example, in here I have 3 images related to 3 political events. The first one, these are the protest in Ferguson a few years ago when there were these Black Lives Matter protests, and the police decided to use military equipment to stop the protest. And images like that evoked a lot of anxiety, fear to people, basically, and were a lot more likely to move and mobilize people in support of the movement. The second image is a lot more recent. It's from, I think, last year. It's related to the border crisis right now, and these families belong together movement in the US. So basically, migrants are being detained, and the children are being separated from their families, and they are being kept in different detention camps, right? And this image also became viral, and part of it's because it evoked these strong emotional reactions to people. And the same with the image from the refugee crisis and the kid dead on the shore, right? And so if you, for a second, try to imagine a counterfactual text describing these images, they wouldn't generate the same emotion that seeing those images actually do. And why is that important? Well, in the last 10 or 15 years, political psychology has made a lot of progress, and now we know that a lot of the things that we do in the political world is related to how we feel about those things. So that was basically about just general statements about why should we care about images, why are they important, and now I'm going to give you some examples from political science research that shows indeed that they do matter. This is a paper from Todorov et al. that was published in Science and was very salient at the time. So what they did is they showed to a set of experiment participants these pairs of images, and these were candidates running in a congressional district, different of the one. So, for example, if I was shown this pair of candidates, these candidates were running in another congressional district that it wasn't mine. So my probability of actually knowing them was very low. And I was shown this pair for just like 2-3 seconds, and then I had to say something about who did I think was the most competent candidate and who would I vote for, basically. They did that for all the congressional districts, and what they saw is basically that what people chose by just taking a quick look at the images correlated very highly with the actual results of the elections. And the claim that they are making is that people probably in real life are making these kind of quick visual calls. They just, taking a quick look at these images, they are assuming who is more competent and then making a decision based on that. So that's a nice example of these image effects in political science. There's also some research showing that the images that go along with a news story, as we saw with the first slide, actually affect our attitudes on that particular topic. So this was an experiment in which people were shown with a headline about a military conflict in Africa, and then they were asked whether they thought that the US should intervene in that conflict. And it was a very low salient conflict to make sure that none of your preconceptions would dig into the decision. And some other people saw the headline plus the image, right? And the effect on people's attitudes was much higher when the image was there, an image of the conflict. People at a higher rate said that yes, the US should do something, the US should intervene. That's another nice example on how images can affect our political attitudes. This from my own research. In here we were studying the attention and the diffusion of the Black Lives Matter on social media, on Twitter. And how images, basically, that people were sharing on social media helped increase the attention and the diffusion of the movement. And in particular, we were interested in the emotions that those images were evoking to people. And what we saw is that images evoking enthusiasm and fear or anxiety were particularly related to people retweeting those tweets more. And not just that, but new people who were not tweeting about the movement before suddenly started engaging with the conversation and supporting the movement online. Yes, please, go ahead.
So here you mean mobilization by just engaging people into conversation, or you somehow, investigate if online behavior somehow appeared in real world?
No, we didn't take that second step. So she was asking if we only investigated online diffusion or also some translation into offline mobilization. No, we didn't do the second thing, so we didn't explore offline mobilization. But around that time, some colleagues were actually doing that. They were studying, when we see the BLM movement diffusing to more people and getting more attention on social media, do we see that translating into offline mobilization? And that they did show that clearly. And that's some work from Freelon at NYU and what's her name? The Chowdhury or something like that. She's at, I can find the reference. So there were a couple teams working on that. And so we decided to focus on the first step. It's like, okay, but what does it make it go viral online first? And probably images and the images that people share in relation to the movement have a lot to do with that. And that's what we showed. Any question about what I said until now? Because now I'm going to get into deep learning, neural nets, and this more technical part. Yes, please.
In the previous paper, so you investigate what make an image viral, essentially.
Yes, yes.
So did you make one to go viral to verify if your research go in the right direction?
That's actually, so this is only observational data, what ended up in the final paper. In an original version of the paper, we didn't create our own image, but we had an experiment in which, it was an online experiment in which you were asked, I think, to sign a petition in support of the BLM movement. And in that case, we were controlling for the particular image. And we were making sure that the image that you were seeing was an image evoking fear or an image evoking enthusiasm. And the findings were totally aligned with the observational data as well.
I have another question.
Yes.
So you work with Twitter, right?
Yes.
Which is a function of enthusiasm and fear, right? We go there to either bullshit about things. So can we really generalize towards images and to make it more tangible? Are you using Twitter pre-November 2015 or after November 2015? Like pre-massive fudging or with massive fudging?
Well, that's a lot of questions in one, I think. So let me say, I think that was pre-2015, if that's useful. And it is true that you probably see people who go on Twitter are more likely to be engaged, to have strong opinions, etc. And so probably the content is more likely to have this emotional component. That being said, most of the images that we saw in our data set didn't generate emotions. Or they generated several emotions. Or at least what we're doing here is conditional on maybe these images being more likely to generate some emotion, compared to other images that we can find in the world. What are the effects of these different emotions, right? But yeah, actually, and if you look at the confidence intervals here, they are getting wider, because we don't have, in the end, that many observations. So this is the degree to which an image generates fear from 0 to 10. Right? So we don't have that many observations in the high emotional values. So most of the research that I just described, or all of the research that I just described, it's either an experiment or a small n case study, like the one that we did with the BLM diffusion. And we all know that this kind of research design, the experiments are great for causal inference. Small n, case studies are great to fully understand what's actually going on, but they have some problems of external validity, right? To what extent the findings that we found in the BLM case are going to hold when we study families belong together or some other kind of social movement. And so ideally, what we would like to do, and that's how I got started into this computer vision stuff, is to do a similar study, but studying a lot of different social movements. In that study, I think we had about 10,000 unique images, and we had an army of manual coders basically going through them and telling us the emotions that they evoked to them. And that was, costly, plus it took us months to label all those images. And so when we wanted to explore more movements, we started thinking, okay, how can we do this automatically? And that's how we got started with these computer vision methods. As Miriam will talk about tomorrow, computer vision, or the results that people were getting by automatically analyzing images, were not great until maybe 5 to 10 years ago. I'm not going to explain in detail this history. That's what's she will do that tomorrow. I'm going to get into neural networks and convolutional neural networks. These new deep learning, machine learning models, thanks to them now, we can get amazing results. So I'm going to start first with neural networks. Probably most of you have seen a version of this diagram in which we have some input data that has some input variables. Then we have some coefficient matrix that we multiply with this input layer, and we generate a new representation of the input, which is this hidden layer. Some of these diagrams or some of these neural nets can have many hidden layers, so many intermediate representations of the input. But in the end, we take the last intermediate representation and we multiply it by a new coefficient matrix to generate some kind of predictions. And this could be like, let's say, 4 image category. Is an image of a protest, of police officers, of politicians, or none of the above, something like that. But how does all this neural network actually work? And that's what I'm going to try to get at. So to me, one of the key ideas to understand neural nets is just remembering basic matrix multiplication that all of us did in high school at some point, or maybe during our undergrads. And if you remember the basics of matrix multiplication, in order to multiply matrix A and B, the number of columns of A and the number of rows of B need to be the same. As long as that's happening, we can multiply those two things. And the output, this matrix C, is going to have the same number of rows as matrix A and the same number of columns of matrix B. And so this is what's going to allow us to make these multiplications and to create these neural nets. I'm going to go step by step. I'm going to start with some a few more abstract ideas, and then I'm going to use a very small example data set that we're going to pass through a neural net step by step so that you can see what we are actually doing when we implement these methods. So in here, just to reiterate on this idea of matrix multiplication, we have a very basic linear, or it could be a general linear model, right? In which we have an input matrix. Each row is an observation in our data set. Then we have 2 variables, x1 and x2. And we have an extra column for the intercept. And so in a statistical modeling, what we want to find, right, is the coefficient matrix that predicts the outcome in a very accurate way. And this coefficient matrix, in a traditional model, we're going to have 1 coefficient for each of the variables in our data set. So in this case, beta 1 is going to be the influence that this variable x1 has on predicting the outcome. These linear models only get us so far. They do very well in a lot of settings. They get very accurate. But the whole deep learning literature started with, can we do better at predicting outcomes? How do we do that? So in here, I have a very simple neural net explained step by step. So in the beginning, in step 1, we have an input matrix X that we're going to multiply by a coefficient matrix. But instead of doing that to produce a set of predictions, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new version of the input matrix. And this new version of the input matrix, because we're doing this matrix multiplication, is going to contain a lot of interactions between the initial input variables. In step 2, a lot of the times what we do, we know that when we apply polynomials and nonlinear transformations in our models, we get more accurate predictions because we adapt those inputs to the particular output that we're interested. So in here, we're applying a nonlinear transformation to this intermediate representation. This is a ReLU transformation. This is very common in computer vision and in convolutional neural net that deal with images. In the next slide, I'm going to explain what a ReLU transformation and other type of transformations are. So we apply some non-linear transformation to this intermediate representation, and then we finally we do a new matrix multiplication with another coefficient matrix to generate a set of predictions. And finally, we apply another nonlinear transformation to these predictions to improve their fit. This is still very abstract. Now, again, I'm going to go with a political science example to understand how this works. But just let me step for a second. So I mentioned a ReLU transformation in the previous slide, and also a sigmoid transformation. So as you get deeper into computer vision and convolutional neural nets, you'll see these terms more and more. Basically, a sigmoid transformation, what it's doing is transforming whatever values we have in a given input or in a given hidden layer. It's transforming them so that they range from 0 to 1. It's a version, basically, of the logistic function. And so this sigmoid transformation is going to be very useful. For example, in here, I added it at the end because I'm trying to predict, this works very well when you're trying to predict outcomes that are binary or outcomes that are probabilities between 0 and 1. The 10 transformation is going to transform any value that you have to range from -1 to 1. And this ReLU transformation, which we use very often again in computer vision, what it's doing is if the values that you have at a given point in time are negative, are below 0, give them a 0. If they are positive, leave them as they are. Something that I complain all the time is how the machine learning community created new names for things that we already had a name for. So these nonlinear transformations, they call them activation functions. Right? So when you see the word activation function, that's actually what's going on. We're transforming some input into a new form by applying these nonlinear transformations. All right, now let me walk you through an example. How can we use a neural net to predict an outcome accurately? So in here, I have the vote share for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 primaries in 7 counties in California, right? Each row is a county, and then we have some information about these counties. We have the percentage of white population, we have the percentage of people who have at least a college degree, and we have the median income per capita, and it's in hundreds US dollars. And the last column, that's the outcome that we want to try to predict, and we want to try to be as accurate as possible, which is the vote share that Hillary Clinton got in those counties. Again, in traditional machine learning, we could just do a linear model and try to find a coefficient matrix that describes the influence of each of these variables on the outcome, right? For example, I highlighted in blue the effect that the percentage of white population has on the outcome. So in this case, we're seeing a negative relationship, right? So the higher the white population, the percentage of white population in the country, in the county, the lower the vote share that went to Hillary, and the higher of the vote share that went to Bernie Sanders, in that case, who was the contender. Again, but these linear models only get us so far. So can we use a neural net to predict the same outcome? And in here, I'm going to go through the 4 steps that we saw in a more abstract way in a previous slide, so that you can see what's actually going on with these neural nets. So we have this input matrix, which is the 3 variables again. So percentage of white population, percentage of college-educated people, and the income in here. And we're going to multiply this X matrix, this input matrix, with a matrix of weights, in this case that has 4 rows and 2 columns. And what that's going to do, it's going to generate a new matrix. And what this matrix is going to be a new way of representing the same input. It's going to be a more, I like to say, more dense representation in the sense that it's going to have a lower dimension, but also it's going to do all these interactions between all the different input variables. Yes?
Did you get values for B1?
Say it again.
The little matrix for B1?
That's a good point. So I was saving it for the end, but basically the quick question is, the quick answer is, we're going to start with random values. And these random values, they are going to have a mean and a standard deviation. And then we're going to try a lot of different combinations until we find the combination that gives us the most accurate results, basically. But I'll say a bit more at the end. So now that we have this new intermediate representation of the input, we're applying this ReLU nonlinear transformation. And so if you can see, in here we ended up with a column of all the values that were negative. And as I said, a ReLU transformation means all negative values go to 0 and all positive values we keep, right? And that's what's happening. So we're setting all these to 0 and we're keeping the positive values. Then the following is yes?
So what would be the intuition before about why you set them to 0? So I mean, when you set them to 0, it's kind of like when you're losing information. So
yes. So actually, in this example, I let this to happen, but usually you don't want the whole column to go to 0. That's usually a sign of your neurons dying. That's how people usually call it. Yeah, you don't want the whole column. Yes?
So one can extend this to this, if you compare it to 10H, right? 10H would be everything looks like Taylor Swift song, right?
Yes.
While this ReLU thing is you're only interested in massive earthquakes, and whenever there's small stuff going on, you don't give a shit, right?
Basically, and what you're also trying is for the values of these intermediate representations to not get too far apart from each other.
Okay.
Basically, because the process of calculating what should be the next values that we should try in this matrix, in this coefficient matrix, so calculating the gradient is getting much harder if the values are getting far apart. So the ReLU setting some values to 0 is bringing the values a bit closer together.
May I follow up?
Yes.
So the discussion about bias in AI in general
Yes.
should, at least in part, be a discussion about exactly these functions, right?
Not really. The discussion is about bias in AI is here, is in the input matrix. It's like the data that we might have available to learn from might not be representative enough. For example, if we're building, let's go to the computer vision world, for example. If we're trying to build a convolutional neural net that is able to distinguish between gender, between female and male, and we only have in our training set, so in the input matrix, we only have images of white people. When suddenly we're trying to use the same model that we learned from those images to predict the gender of a black person, suddenly it might start going wrong, right? So it's totally biased. It's
another source of bias.
Yes. So basically, we are having a problem with the input, with what we're learning from. So all these nonlinear transformations is conditional on this training data set. How can we get the most accurate results? And in the fastest way, or the most efficient way. So yeah, going back to here, you usually don't want the whole column to go to 0. In here, I did it so that it was very clear what we were doing, what this ReLU transformation is doing. So usually there will be some values that are not 0. And so finally, then we take this intermediate representation to which we apply the nonlinear transformation to make the values be much closer and to make it easier to calculate the gradient and to improve fit. And we finally multiply it with another matrix. And in this case, we generate a vector of predictions. But to improve those predictions even more, we apply this sigmoid, this extra nonlinear transformation. And finally, we end up with some proportions, and so some vote share that we are predicting for Hillary Clinton in those 7 counties. As I said, so we have 2 coefficient matrices that we need to estimate, this beta 2 and this beta 1. How do we do that? And I'm just going to say what I said earlier, just to reiterate, is we're going to start with some random values, and we're going to try different combinations of values for those coefficient matrices. And we're going to evaluate which of those values are giving us the most accurate predictions, basically. We're going to take the difference between our predictions and the actual vote share for Hillary Clinton in those counties, and we're going to look for the set of values that give us the lower difference. Now that we know how neural nets work, let me just add one extra layer to this, which is this idea of convolutional neural nets. A convolutional neural net is just a neural net in which at least one of the layers we're using a convolution. And I'm going to explain what a convolution is. And this is important because these convolutions make it very easy. They don't make matrix multiplications that are that difficult to make, and so they reduce computation power, and they make it feasible to use neural nets for image analysis. Because images, as I'll say next as well, you can represent them as 3-dimensional matrices, and if you were applying full matrices with other coefficient matrices, it would be just incredibly hard to estimate these models. Let me take one step back though and go through the example one more time. So in here we have the same input matrix that we had with this information about each county. We multiply by a coefficient matrix and generate a new intermediate representation. We apply the same ReLU transformation, so all those negative values we transform to 0 to bring things closer. And in here we have a convolution. So basically now, instead of multiplying this intermediate representation entirely with a new matrix to generate a new output, what we're doing is we're going to slide what we call a filter instead of a weights or a coefficient matrix through this matrix. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to multiply this coefficient by this number in here, and we're going to multiply this coefficient by this second number in here. And we're going to add them up and record them here in the output. And then in the next step, we're just going to slide this filter. So instead of these 2, then we're going to try these other 2. We're going to multiply the first number by the first number, the second number by the second number. We're going to add them up, and we're going to record them in there. So as you can see, we're not fully multiplying 2 matrices. We're just sliding this filter through the first matrix, which makes the whole multiplication process a lot simpler, much faster, and easier to compute. And this is what we're going to use with images. And this is, once we have the intermediate representation, we multiply it again to generate a set of predictions and apply a nonlinear transformation to have a final set of predictions. Any question about neural nets and convolutional neural nets at this point? All right. So how do we go from having these neural nets and convolutional neural nets to actually use them to learn something from images? So the key is that we can represent images as 3-dimensional matrices, basically. The way we do that is each image or each color, right, is some kind of combination of red, green, and blue. And so an image can be represented as these 3 dimensions in which each cell of the matrix is telling us the amount of red, green, and blue in that particular pixel. And usually these are going to be standardized values that range from 0 to 255. And so we can now use this input matrix and slide a lot of coefficients and pass it through these neural nets to try to learn something about the image. For example, what we're going to do, as I said in the hands-on tutorial, is predict whether an image is of a street protest, right? So we're going to have some examples of images of a street protest and some examples of images that are not of a street protest. And we're going to pass them through a neural net, and based on the color pixel level intensities, it's going to try to learn how to predict the outcome, this binary outcome that we're interested in. Just to give you some sense of how this convolution works, these convolutional layers work when we're using images. In here we have an input image, and again, it's going to be the color intensity of the blue intensity, the green intensity, and the red intensity at each pixel. I made it simple in here. Instead of ranging from 0 to 255, these ranges from 0 to 2. And these are the filters that are going to do the convolution. So in this case, we have 2 filters, and each filter has a 2 by 2 by 3 dimension. What means is the 3 means that each filter actually has 3 sub-filters. And the 2 by 2 means that it has 2 rows and 2 columns, right? And so each of these sub-filters we're going to use for each separate dimension. And what we're going to do is, as I said earlier, we're going to slide these coefficients through each channel and performing the multiplication and recording it in here. For example, in here we're multiplying all this number by all these numbers and adding them up, all these numbers by all these numbers and adding them up. The same in here, and then we add the 3 final numbers that we get from the 3, and we record them in here, these number 6. Yeah? So it's kind of a pain to go through like the logistics of it, but I think it's very important to understand what we're doing, especially when you start programming and you don't know why you're getting some kind of error. Well, that's the logic that you're trying to trace back when you are programming these convolutional neural nets. One final thing about convolutional neural nets for image processing. Sometimes we add these pooling layers. What the pooling layer is actually doing is reducing the input or the output at some point in time to a smaller dimension, so that in the next iteration we'll have, it's going to be, well, there are 2 reasons. One is because we want to condense all this information in a very dense space, because sometimes that helps us to learn from the input. But also it simplifies and it reduces the number of weights and the number of coefficients that we need to learn in future iterations or in future layers. So this is a max pooling, which means is we're taking all these numbers in this matrix and we're pulling the maximum number and only keeping that one. And that's a way of representing the same matrix in a much smaller format. And so this is an example of how a convolutional neural net for image classification can look like. We sometimes, we have some convolutional layers. In this case, it was a convolutional layer with 10 filters. That's why it generated 10 outputs. Then whatever output we generate, we apply some nonlinear transformation, and now you know what this ReLU transformation is doing. Is getting rid of the negative values and only keeping the positive. And in between, we add some pooling layers to bring everything to a denser space and to reduce the amount of coefficients in the future layers. And finally, at the end, we do have a fully connected matrix multiplication, a fully connected layer that tries to use all these inputs and all these intermediate representations to predict, for example, the probability of this image to be a car, a truck, or a set of defined classes that you have in the beginning. All right, to finish up this more technical part, let me just check the time to see how I'm doing. All right, not that bad. Again, as I said, machine learning people like to create new names for things we already have a name for. So I'm just going to walk you through some basic ideas that you probably already know, but sadly they have a new name. So the input layer is basically your data, your input data, right? The weights is a coefficient matrix, right? This matrix that we're going to multiply with our input or by our intermediate representations to create either new intermediate representations or a set of predictions. They are called weights. The bias is just the intercept. Like in a linear model or any kind of model, we have an intercept. Basically, in the absence of any value for the rest of the variable, what's the value that we should expect for a given problem? So the bias. The loss function is basically how are you gonna measure how well your model is doing, right? I said earlier, what we can do is just take the difference or the absolute difference between our set of predictions and the actual value, right? That's the loss function. Or you could do take the square and then take the difference, right? There are different ways that you can calculate how well your model is performing. That's going to be the loss function. Regularization means bringing all your input data into a similar scale. So if we go to our example with the California counties, not all the variables seem to be in a very different scale, right? We have US dollar in hundreds, we have 2 percentages. So sometimes what it helps when it comes to estimating these neural nets and these convolutional neural nets is to have these values, for example, all ranging from 0 to 1. So all being in a very equivalent scale. That's what people call regularization. Dropout. So these convolutional neural nets or these neural nets, because we have so much data and so many intermediate representations to learn from, we are likely to just overfit the model. Basically, to create a model that does a perfect job at predicting our cases that we use in the training data set, which is not really what we want, right? We want to learn something from those cases, and we want to learn a model or build a model that then we can apply to other cases. So one way to avoid this overfitting is by having this dropout. Dropout, what it means is, if you remember, I said that we ran different iterations of the process, trying out different combinations of values in the coefficient matrices until we find the ones that perform best. So dropout means at these different iterations, we're going to set up some of the values in the coefficient matrix to 0 or to some random value. So basically what we're going to do every time that we run the model is part of what you learned in the previous iterations, forget about it. And it's a way to not just create a model that predicts perfectly our training data but doesn't generalize very well. Yes?
Does it matter how you randomize? Like if you forget in a Gaussian way, Levy way? That's
a really good point. I don't have an answer. Okay. I'm sure it does. So that's so someone from the machine learning community will probably have a good answer to that. I usually follow kind of standard procedures, but yeah, I don't have a good answer. I'm sure there is a paper trying like 10 different ways to see which is the most accurate one. Yeah.
So when you do this in your research, do you usually do like a sweep over these parameters, or do you do
Yes.
Okay.
Usually I do a grid search. So for example, some of the hyperparameters, especially that we talk in the next column. Yeah, I know from previous experience, like what are probably the best values, but still I try several combinations of them. And so I ran the same model maybe with 10 or 20 or 100 different setups with different permutations of these hyperparameters.
Do you have intuition of which ones are like the most?
Yes. So definitely the one that you have to pay the most attention is the learning rate. And I'll get to that. Basically, the learning rate is by how much you want to change the values in your coefficient matrices at each iteration. Every time that you try a new set of values, So do you go, for example, in here, right? We have 0.46. In the next iteration, we're going to try a different value here. How much different does it need to be? Should we go from 0.46 to 0.48? Or should we go from 0.46 to 0.90 something, right? And that's what the learning rate is doing. And that influences your results a lot. And the learning rate can cause things, the wrong learning rate can cause things like this one. So a whole variable to die on you and not send any signal and not learn from it. All right, that's dropout. Forward propagation means performing all the matrix multiplications that we just saw once. That's a forward propagation. And a back propagation means calculating the gradient of the function, which in other ways, what means is deciding kind of what the new values, the direction of the new values for the coefficient matrix that we're going to check, basically, that we're going to test. That's a back propagation. Train, test, validation, split. So usually we want to, if we have a data set with, let's say, 1,000 observations. Instead of the 7 counties that we had in the previous example, we have information about 1,000 counties. We probably want to split those, let's say, 800 and a couple hundred, and we want to train the model in 800, but still save a couple hundred that we don't use their information at all to train the model, just to check how well the model is doing, to test how well the model is doing. It's actually called the validation set. So at each iteration, at each new set of values that we're going to give to the coefficient matrix, we're going to see how well those values are doing at predicting and making predictions for the training set, but also for the validation set that we saved apart and we didn't use for learning. And once we think that we got to a point of convergence, that the neural net cannot do better, it doesn't matter how more epochs we're running these neural nets, it's not getting better, let's stop. Then we want to save a test set that we're gonna use it for, at the end, double check how well is actually doing our neural net. It could be that we decide to stop the training process because the model is already doing very well in our validation set, but it might just be that it's doing very well on that particular validation set. It's not doing very well in general. So that's why we want to save a test set for the end to double check that it's actually generalizing well. Batch size, that's very common in computer vision. Basically, let me go through the example again. So performing, again, these matrices, matrix multiplications is computationally, costly. And so what sometimes we do is, with the same set of weights, without doing any updates, without updating any coefficients, we first pass only through 2 of the observations through a neural net. So we only perform all these multiplications for 2 of the cases and generate a set of predictions and calculate the loss. And then we do it for a new batch of 2 observations, and then a new batch of 2 observations until we're done with the whole data set. And then the loss that we got for each of these batches, we average it to have a general loss for that particular set of coefficients. And that's just a way of speeding up computation. And the batch size also helps with not overfitting the model that much. Well, no, let me go through the next ones. Epochs, that's the number of times you run your algorithm. So the number of times you do a forward propagation and a backward propagation. And the learning rate, as I said, is by how much you update your values in the coefficient matrices. All right, now I'm going to pass, after the technicalities, I'm going to go to more applied research. Do you have any question about what we went through? There is a question over there.
Yeah, the image processing is just about colors, as you say, or you can process any other kind of values about the image? It's something that I didn't understand, or was just a simple example?
That's a good question. So nowadays, it's mostly pixel level color intensities. It doesn't have to be three-dimensional matrices. So some people, what they do is they first transform these three-dimensional matrix into just a single matrix by bringing this color to grayscale, so only black and white, and that makes the whole process much simpler because you go from 3 to 1 dimensions. And depending on the problem that you are trying to deal with, so if you are trying to recognize particular objects in an image, and so you're only interested in shapes, the grayscale might actually give you already very accurate results. If you think that your outcome of interest, let's say you want to predict the emotions images evoke, colors probably have something to say about it, and so you want to probably keep it in this three-dimensional color world. But yeah, in the past, people used to use different type of features, like when there were particular sharps, corners, or things like that, they were trying to pull that information from the image and use that as input. But nowadays, less and less people are using these extra features, just because these convolutional neural nets with the raw image work very well. Maybe Miriam will say something more about this stuff tomorrow, I'm sure. Yeah. You had a question?
Yes, so your slide with the final car
yes, let me go there. Yes.
Is looking very complicated. What is the methodology in determining all of these steps? Because it sounds to me like magic. Threw it in until we got like good.
I mean, we've seen in this previous slide, right? We have one convolution. We don't have a nonlinear transformation here, but we can easily see how we could do a ReLU here, right? By setting this 1 to 0, 0, 0, and then a max pool, right? So that would be just this, right? It is true that people got obsessed about just getting deeper and deeper, basically by adding more and more layers, because it gives you extra opportunities to learn from the data. In the beginning, we couldn't get deeper just because we didn't have the computational power, right, to get that much deep. People are now going crazy with like a couple hundred layers. And it doesn't seem to be improving that much already. That being said, what's the right structure that you should go for? I think that's a question I cannot really answer.
So besides just evaluating your performance,
yeah, I mean,
is there any theoretical reason? Like, well, maybe we're learning more abstract concepts, or?
Yeah, I think that the idea is as you add more layers, different layers end up focusing on different things. So some layers are going to focus on particular colors. Some layers are going to focus on shapes. Some layers are going to focus on other things. But yeah, that doesn't really answer the question, how many should we have, how many are enough, etc. Yes, you had a
reformulation of the same
yeah.
question. So the magic thing is there is no neural science of artificial neural networks yet.
Yeah, no, that's something that machine learning people are good at branding themselves. And so they like to call it neural nets and do this parallelism with neural science. This parallelism, it's kind of there in the sense that you have different filters focus on different parts of the problem. So it's kind of these neurons focusing on different parts of the image to try to understand something. But no, I haven't seen like clear papers laying out some neural theories that map onto particular setups.
Can you get any formal guarantees of how wrong your model can be in the worst case?
What do you mean? So what's?
by the end of it, we want to say something about
What's the baseline, for example? Yeah.
and then we are really only saying something about what this model produces without inferences. So can we say something along the lines of, okay, maybe some of the classifications were wrong, but that's like less than 20%.
I don't know if I'm following. Let me try to answer it, and if it's not the answer you are looking for, then ask the question again. So one way to judge how well our model is doing is by trying to find some kind of baseline, right? And that baseline could be, for example, if it's an unbalanced training set, let's say that we're trying to predict, let's say that we only have these categories in our training data. So we have some example of horses, sheep, airplanes, trucks, and cars. But in our training set, there are a lot more cars than the other classes, right? Let's say that it's 50% cars, and then the rest are the other classes. If our classifier is 50% accurate, that doesn't mean that much, right? Because by random chance, by giving the model label to all the images, we would be already getting a 50% accuracy. So that's one way of judging or having a baseline for your model. And the other way is just trying different models or seeing with what people with other models, what's the accuracy that they have generated and how well is yours performing compared to that one. Is that what you were looking for or not?
I was hoping for some sort of like formal guarantees, like beyond how well is it doing on the training stuff, but I guess that's something that's not possible.
I mean, that's a pretty good formal guarantee, right? If it's a supervised problem, if you have a clearly defined set of categories you want to predict, how well you are predicting those categories, I think that's already a good way of judging how well it is doing. Maybe we can follow up and see if I can fully understand what you're getting at. Yes?
You said that different layers tend to focus on different parts of the images.
Mm-hmm.
And is that something that just happens? Or do you actually think about, okay, I need one layer that concentrates on this and that?
No, not really. It just happens. It just happens. And so what you end up doing is, this is a visualization of the weights. So basically, so here we have a weight matrix, right? Where we have some values that are lower and some values that are higher. And actually, I already color them in different gray intensities depending on whether they are higher, right? And this is the same that it's happening here. And so basically, by looking at this representation of the filters, what you can see is what kind of features are the filters in that layer focusing on, right? So for example, the first one seemed to be focusing on shape, right? But the final ones, you don't see very clear shape features moving them, so they're probably focusing on colors or other stuff at that point.
So in your research, is it more common to use pre-trained models and apply them to the problem you want to solve, or follow some of the architectures that are more common, or use your own, build your own models from scratch?
So that's a really good question, and that's what we're going to do in the hands-on tutorial later. So the answer is, I focus on using models that have already been trained, so pre-trained, and then I just adapt them to the particular thing that I need the model to do. So what we're going to do, there's this big image data set. It's called ImageNet, and there is an annual competition of people trying to put together the best convolutional neural net to perform the best with that data set. ImageNet has 1,000 objects or classes, and so these are 5 of these 1,000 objects, actually. And then people make those models available online. So you can now use some of the models that got the best results in the ImageNet competition from 3 or 4 years ago. And then what you do is, for example, what we're going to do later today is, in here we have a last fully connected layer, that it's predicting the probability of that image to be one of these 1,000 classes. We're going to replace this last fully connected layer, and instead of predicting 1,000 classes, we're going to use the same neural net to predict a binary outcome, whether the image is an image of a street protest or not. And then what you can do is either freeze these coefficients, so you could not update them at all, and only learn the new coefficient matrix that you added to the end, or you could let them learn a little bit based on your new training data. What that's doing is there are some things that this neural net has learned from complete different images and complete different data that it's going to help me get accurate results much faster than if I had to train my neural net from scratch. Plus, the extra thing is I'm only going to use, you'll see in the hands-on tutorial, I think a couple hundred images. So 100 images of protest and 100 images that are not of a protest. And only with a data set of 200, we're going to achieve accuracy that it gets very close to 100% accuracy. And this is in part because this pre-trained model has already learned a lot of ways of predicting image outcomes from these image features. I have until 11, right? Claudia? Yeah? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna, just to see if it works as a source of inspiration, I'm gonna go through a couple of examples of like super recent papers. One has been published like a couple months ago, and the other one is still a working paper, in which they use convolutional neural nets to train a supervised classifier in order to say something or to answer a political science question. So this is a paper by Francisco Cantú. He's a professor in the political science department at the University of Houston. And he studies, he's a comparativist. He studies comparative politics and especially non-authoritarian regimes. Most of his research is from Mexico. That's where he's originally from. And in this case, in this paper, he's trying to get at ways in which non-democratic regimes can stay in power. The Mexican government, before this, the data from this study is from 1988, and right before the 1988 presidential election, they passed a new law to centralize basically the vote count of all the votes in the polling stations, basically. Before that, each state or different municipalities would do the vote count and will send it to the central government. Now, all the central government receives the vote tallies from the different states, and they make the final count, and they make it public in the end. And so what Francisco was thinking is like, well, probably the party in power. So until not that many years ago, in Mexico, there was always the same party. There were elections, but there was this party, the PRI, who was kind of the regime party and was always winning these elections. So what he thought that was going on, or the reason why they passed this new policy, is because he thought that they were about to lose that election, and they wanted to make sure that they won that election, and they wanted to count and change the vote count for some states or for some counties if they didn't go their way. How do you test that? So basically what he did is he collected, he went to the National Archive and he took images of all the vote tallies from all the municipalities in some states, basically. Let me show you how this looked like. So basically in here you have the name of the party and how many votes that party got into during the general election in Mexico. So he went and collected all of these for a set of municipalities. So he ended up with about 53,000 images like that one. And then for each of those vote tallies, he knows the number of votes that the government reported as being in favor of each parties in that district, basically. And that's what he's gonna compare. Well, what he's doing is he's training a convolutional neural net to predict a binary outcome. And in this case, the outcome that it's going to predict is whether there is something wrong or there's been some manipulation on this vote tally. So this one, in these ones, you don't see any weird thing. You don't see any scratches, any edits to the vote tally. But in this one, you do, right? You see suddenly some votes have changed in there, some in there, etc. So these are going to be true positives, and these are going to be true negatives to train this convolutional neural net. This is the architecture of the neural net. We are already now a lot more familiar with what's going on, a lot of filters, then there is some max pooling, etc. And at the end, there are these fully connected layers to predict this binary outcome. Let me go to results. Basically, these are the results for 3 different parties. And this is the party that was in government, the PRI. And what's showing in here is the blue is the distribution for the vote tallies. Let me see if I can explain this well. So blue means that the vote tallies were not edited at all. They were not fraudulent. And the orange ones are the ones that there were some issues with them, right? And in the x-axis, we have the proportion of votes that went for that party from that ballot, from that vote tally, basically. And we see for the PRI that the places in where they got most of the votes, so close to 100%, is in places where the vote tallies were actually corrupt. There was something wrong with those vote tallies. But that's not the case with the other 2 parties that were running for the election. And so I think I had to review this paper. And when I saw this paper, I was like, wow, this is like the perfect example of how you can use this method, not just because it's cool, which is, please don't do things because they are cool. In this case, there was a clear theoretical reason that could have not been unlocked unless you actually use these kind of techniques. And so it's a nice way of how you can say something new and we can learn and answer political science questions using these methods. Any question about this one? Yes?
So has they put some of the tallies by comparing to the official data that has been reported, or
Yeah, so the official data, so they look at the images and they said, is there something wrong with them or not? That's how they labeled whether there was some kind of fraudulent activity going on. And the official data is here, is the proportion of votes that the government's, so basically it's the proportion or the share that was reported in that municipality.
But when they got the tallies, they had to tick by hand something wrong?
No, they didn't do that. They are just showing that it would be really, if the error basically was randomly distributed, that these 3 distributions should look very similar for the 3 parties, right? But for the only one that doesn't look similar is for the government, for the party from the government.
So if they didn't have the target, how did they train the neural nets?
No,
You always have to supervise.
Yes, definitely. So they did have examples. They did label all these tallies for whether they were corrupt, or not all of them, only 1,000 of them. They labeled them for whether they were corrupt or not. And they predicted the rest.
Do they reproduce the retributions for the training set? Like, what are the distributions for the training set?
Oh, if the training set was balanced or not?
Yeah.
I don't remember that. That's a good point. But the final model is like super accurate.
So if you would be a
the results.
Who look like an artist or a radiologist,
yes,
looking at that stuff, I find this 3 very suspicious.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, they actually had, I think 3 or 4 coders going through each of the images in the training set. Mm-hmm. And I think they used a maximum voting. So at least 3 of the 4 coders had to say, this is a true positive or this is a true negative. Yeah. yeah, it's still human judgment at the end of the day. It's
Yeah, it's a human judgment, and you cannot say that what is really true positive to anything. So in a sense, it's impossible.
yeah, true positive. Yeah, maybe that's.
In a sense,
I mean,
the
from a
piece
modeling
of the-
perspective, that's how you treat them.
But the
But
piece of the
are
paper
they-
is false, in a sense. You cannot say it is true or false. Maybe just an honest guy was just trying to rewrite when you make a mistake, you just try to rewrite the same number in a better way. I don't know, just the
Sure, that could be. Until you see the results, I think. So it could be that there is some error when it comes. No, I mean, it could be that there is some error. I mean, the error should be the coding error, the initial coding error of these things should be super biased in order to observe the results that you see. Like incredibly biased. In a way that theoretically, I don't know how we would explain that bias in the training set, right?
So I'm convinced by the plot. But
Yeah.
The key thing is what's the difference between humans classifying 53,000 images,
Yep.
which takes a week, versus doing it in a
I don't know if it takes a week, 53,000.
You can look at 8,000 images a day, 3 seconds each. So
Oof. But then the error goes up. To give you a sense for the images that matter paper, the one that we had to manually label 10,000,
yeah.
I think it took us three or 4 months. Yeah, but again, it's not that easy, right? As you said, you got to look at it. Okay, do I think that the 3 was there before or not? I don't think it's that quick to make that kind of call. And if you need several coders, you need to train them. It's not a random amount of time that they would have spent doing all of this.
I think this is a discussion we should have a lot this week, right? So a radiologist
Yes.
who looks at an X-ray picture and says, 15 X-ray pictures, the third from the left has this and that cancer. That decision takes about a second. If the guy or girl is trained for 10 years staring at images,
Yeah.
there's probably arguably no difference between that person and a really good trained neural network. And of course, if you can multiply that, you can look at billions of X-ray pictures, which is obviously a benefit over having that person trained for 10 years. So that's really cool.
Yep.
So if you can make that argument, you can say, hey, we can actually use that
Yeah.
much easier. I can look at pictures for a week, but you can't do this for 400 million people.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
And the other thing is that you can also say, well, sometimes the algorithm is going to be, the prediction is going to be very unclear, right?
yeah.
So it's going to be close to the 50-50 call. So you can say, well, let's use the algorithm for most of the cases where the algorithm is super certain about the prediction. But when the algorithm is like, well, there's a 50-50 call, okay, let's set those examples aside, and those should go to human annotators, right? That's something that I do often, basically. But it helps you, yeah.
Although there are many variables where the algorithm wouldn't be able to learn, right? There are human things, you know, if you are on the border or if it's a particular kind of case, maybe you don't want to tell you know, there are decisions that are made on a human level, right? If it could be a false positive, you know, phrase it a certain way. But also, this person might have been learning this over many kinds of technologies, right? And they've seen these images from many different angles depending on the scanning equipment that was around, right? So if we have now new scanning equipment, would this algorithm be able to update their knowledge as fast as a human would? So.
Yeah. No, definitely. And something that I encourage people to do during this week is to think a lot about the labeling process, right? How do you create this training set that you're gonna use to train the algorithm, and how do you train a set of people who are gonna be labeling initially all these voting tallies, and what are potential problems that might occur during that process, and how we address them in a way that it's systematic and that it distributes whatever error is happening, you know, kind of randomly across different classes. Yeah.
Well, I will play a little bit cynical here. So it is not the first time that comparative digital scientists know that a non-democratic government, they try to manipulate democratic elections, right? So do you think that it is the innovative methods used here that get these published in one of the top journals in the United States?
I think in this case is to clearly to show it in a way that people didn't have never shown it before. Right? I think it was a combination of a question. I mean, the other thing is that there were some other competing theories at that point, right? It doesn't have to go through election fraud. So the election fraud can happen in a lot of ways. So changing the final vote tallies is only one way. But it could be, that the networks in a given municipality, let's say the people who own the companies, and so who has power among the employers in that district, they might, put pressure or do a lot of different tactics to influence the voting. It doesn't have to be this way, right? The fact that the government decided to centralize a vote count at some point kind of pointed towards that direction, but there was no clear evidence that that was actually the case. I agree that it's not like any crazy, super innovative idea to begin with, but I think that the creativity in terms of how they went about testing the method helped us get into APSR in this case. So I think the answer is, if a similar paper, not in this particular topic, but a similar paper using computer vision techniques, try to get published in APSR now, probably would have it a much harder time, right? Because we've already seen how these techniques can help us answer questions that are not obvious, but well, it's not that hard to figure out that it's probably going that way. Yeah. I am running out of time. Let's see, what do I want to do? So in here I wanted to talk about a similar paper that does something similar. In this case, they predict the level of violence in protest images. So there's a lot of protests that happen in different countries, and people were posting images of those protests on social media. And these are protests that lasted for several days, or social movements that were alive for like a long period of time. And so the idea in here, they test a lot of different things, right? But the idea, one of the things that they test is the extent to which when violence happens in a given protest, how does that affect attendance to the protest related to that same social movement in the future. And so they trained basically, it was a binary classifier as well, whether an image shows violence or not. And then they train it on a set of images, and then they predicted the probability of all the images from those different social movements and protests to be violent. And here you can see how these images look. As you go to the right, the more violent these images actually are. And basically what they find is that, yes, when the average score for a set of images related to a specific protest from a day, the average violence score goes up, we see less people attending in the subsequent, basically, protests related to that same cause. It's just another way of trying to test some hypotheses using these kind of convolutional neural nets and using images to measure some concepts that you're interested in and might be hard for you to measure otherwise, right? Another way that you could do it is by say, okay, these particular protests that happen in Spain, it has been probably covered in the Spanish newspaper. Let's look at the image that Spanish newspapers have used for that protest to see if it has been violent or not. So instead of looking at all the images that people tweeted that day, let's see just a single one, right? But it could be totally biased, and it could be a function of the editorial interest with that protest, etc. So by looking at a cumulative set of pictures from people who actually went to that protest, right? The idea is that you can get a more, hopefully a less biased estimate of the level of violence. This is still a working paper. They're still validating a lot of the measures, but just to try to see, to communicate the kind of things that you can do. Yeah.
How are you going, well, if you're planning to cover the protests that took place in Moscow recently, when people just standing with invisible posters or posters with no text there, and they just taken by the police, and that's it. So it's not somehow a flyer on this or a lot of people in the picture. So in terms of this model, it might not be.
So is the problem that people are not taking pictures?
No, they're not. They're just standing.
Mm-hmm.
There is, well, it is very hard to organize the protest.
Yes.
But in case they are somehow protesting, it can be one person standing somewhere on the city square with invisible protest. So they just stay.
Just a sign?
Yeah, just a sign, or it's just white paper.
Yep.
But it also kind of a protest, and it's violent because after like this kind of a protest, this person is always actually go.
But maybe you don't have an image of the second part, where the person is taking over.
It's Russia. There is no second part.
Yeah. So then you know, or you have a good hunch that tells you that the model is not going to work in that particular situation.
But okay, so this model you were talking about, there's only for that kind of a, let's say, classical protest when you see that it's somehow developing and braiding.
Yeah.
Like I don't like your Ramadan type was it?
Yeah.
So it's classical for this
Yeah.
kind of model.
So I think that in this case, all the protests that they were, or most of the protests that, or all the protests that they were looking at, are from democratic regimes. So they probably don't have these kind of problems. But if they were to have, or to say something about a country where you don't have a second chance to take a picture when the things get violent, then they have a problem of external validity, right? They probably are building the wrong measures. So that's something definitely that you always have to keep in mind when building the research design.
Does the perception of violence depend on which country is reporting on the same struggle?
Yeah, I think, I think it relates very well to the other question, right? Which is, you gotta make sure that you think carefully about what you're measuring before you start measuring, right? So that you have the model that actually captures violence, or what it's understood as violence in that particular country. And if you think that in that particular country violence might be understood in a completely different way, then you should work towards that. So you should probably recruit manual coders from that country. You should probably have a separate model for each of the countries. So instead of having training images from all the countries and building a single model, you probably need to have a training data set from each country that has been labeled by people from that country and have a separate model.
Yeah, but I mean, given the same definition of violence, and the same scale of violence
you're
measuring, since you already have a neural network telling you the measure of violence, can you determine whether in a country this is just a certain protest is supported by that country or not? Because I can admit, if I'm a journalist in a country which supports a certain protest, for example, a protest against a government which my government does not like, I suppose that the journals are more prone to show peaceful images of that protest rather than
Yeah, definitely. So that's why in that case, in this paper, the images being used are from protesters who are tweeting about it. Yeah, what I was saying is that that's a good approach because of that in particular, right? An alternative would be, let's go to the newspapers that are reporting about these protests and just use those images. But those could be totally biased because of, editorial lines or government interests or etc. Yeah, and definitely, that's, as a scientist, that's what you have to constantly be thinking about it, right? It's like, what could be biasing my data set and my results, etc. All right, I think I ran out of time, so we're going to break here. I wanted to talk about some unsupervised topic modeling that we're doing with images, but if any of you are interested in it, it's basically, if any of you are familiar with LDA models for text analysis that takes a set of documents and clusters them into meaningful topics, we're now trying to do something very similar with images in cases that you don't really know the particular objects that you're looking for. So that it clusters images when they are very similar, into these clusters that go nicely together, and then you can just learn what particular cluster is about. So if any of you is interested in that, I can talk about it offline when we're done today. So we're going to break now, and then we're going to come back for a hands-on tutorial.